and the big boulder flew westward, tumbling as it went, slowing as it reached the height of its arc, and then dropping down towards the fort like an anvil from orbit. Dust puffed up around the trebuchet, and from under its wheels and the 4 screwjacks that stabilized it for firing.
"Hit!"
shouted a bear-killer trooper, looking through a pair of heavy tripod-mounted binoculars they'd reclaimed from a tourist lookout point.
"Hit!"
Larson had his own monocular out and put to his good eye. The castle was about half a mile away, and he wanted to know just how his baby functioned. He could see where the quarter-ton rock had struck. In the middle of the earth wall of the fort, halfway between ditch and the palisade. A cloud of dirt drifted away, and he saw the boulder 3/4 buried in the heaped soil. Well, so far we're just helping build the castle wall, Larson thought. No damage except to the barbed wire. But next time...
"Incoming!"
the woman at the binoculars shouted. Then,
"Short!"
Larson looked, tense to dive for the slit trench. A rock rose over the gate of the castle, arching up. In a reverse of his own shot, it seemed to get faster and faster as it approached.
Thud!
It landed in the roadway, cracking and cratering the asphalt, then rolling along until it came to a halt about 100 yards in front of his own trebuchet. More than enough to hammer anything trying to sneak by the castle on either side, but less range than his, with a lighter load. Probably mounted on some sort of turntable. "You couldn't have thought you'd be the only one to come up with this idea, Professor," Larson said with an evil chuckle. To the crew,
"All right, winch her down."
The crew sprang to work, pumping at the cranks on either side of the frame's rear. There was a quick ratcheting clatter as they took up the slack on the 2 woven wire cables that ran up to the peak of the throwing arm and out through the block and tackle at the middle of the rear brace. That slowed as the weight came on the cables, and they had to work at it, but the gearing made the effort steady rather than hard. At last the arm was down, and Larson threw the lever that brought the jaws of the clamp home on it, and slipped home the safety pin. A steel rod the thickness of his thumb, and as long as his forearm. "We need something a little lighter if we want to hit the palisade or the interior," he said, looking down the row of boulders. Each had its weight chalked on the surface, along with a serial number. "Number 32. The loading crew had 2-man pinchers for carrying stones, with turned-in sections at the tips, and stout horizontal wooden handles like spades. 4 men went after boulder 32, each pair clamping their pinchers on it and walking it over to the sling. Larson carefully raised the chain and loop and dropped them over the hook, removed the pin.
"Incoming!"
This time the yell was much louder, and the sound from the castle was different. A long, vibrating tongue from the Mott Tower.
"Cover!"
Larson said, and jumped into a slit trench. Havel had smiled that crooked smile when he told them those should go in first. "I'm not doing bad for an old man," he thought, puffing and keeping his head down. "So I may not be good at waving swords." Something went over his head with a loud whoosh. A fractional second later there was a sharp crack from behind him. He turned and raised his head. There was a row of mantlets about 10 yards behind the rock thrower. Heavy shields on bicycle wheels for archers and bowmen to push towards hostile walls. One had been hit. Not just hit, he thought, whistling softly to himself. The missile was a 4-foot spear-sized arrow with plastic vanes and a pile-shaped head. It had punched right through the metal facing and double thickness of plywood, and buried itself in the ribcage of a rancher's man who'd been leading a horse behind. The man went down, screaming like a rabbit in a trap and flailing with his arms, but the legs stayed immobile. More people scattered eastward, running from the sudden danger. A few ran 3 or 4 steps, then turned and dashed back to drag the injured man to safety. He screamed even louder at that, and was undoubtedly going to die anyway. A pre-changed trauma unit probably couldn't have saved him, but that was well done, Larson thought, wincing slightly. Still, Ouch. He'd gotten case-hardened since the change. His mind suppressed memories of the night of blood and screams in the ranger cabin with an effort so habitual that he didn't even have to think about it. But this isn't just a game of engineers, the way business was a game with money for counters. Or if it is, it's a game with human beings as pieces. On the heels of the thought came more distant sounds from the castle. 6 together this time. Tung, 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 tung.
The first was a ranging shot,
Larson shouted.
Heads down, everyone!
More black dots came floating out from the castle, from the tower and along the wall. Deceptively slow-looking at first, then gathering speed. Larson dropped to the bottom of his hole and looked upward. Something went overhead in a blur, and there was a hard whack sound of metal on metal. Duller chunks of steel spearheads buried themselves in wet dirt. There were shouts, but no screams. Larson shouted himself.
Everyone stay in their holes until I say you can come out.
There was no quaver in his voice. He was proud of that. He knew the javelins probably couldn't hurt him, but his gut and scrotum didn't seem to know that, and they were sending very unpleasant messages up to his hindbrain. When he thought about what he was going to do next, his sphincter got into the action. And I can come out myself whenever I want. I don't want to, but I'm going to do it anyway. He launched himself out of the trench. The loop at the end of the firing lanyard was about a dozen yards away. The point of his hook sank into the dirt in the middle of it, and he let his backward slither pull it taut.
Chang! Whack!
The boulder arched out towards the Protector's castle. Before it was halfway, the multiple musical tung of the dart-throwers sounded. Now I understand why they had so many sieges in the Middle Ages, and why everyone hated them, he muttered to himself as he tumbled back into the protective embrace of his foxhole.
Hit!
Someone shouted after the javelin struck.
Broke off a section of the palisade this time.
He could hear the crew cheering from their trenches and felt like shouting himself, until he realized that he'd probably pulped several men into hamburger with a 300-pound boulder, and equally probably mutilated and crippled several more. But I'm not going to get bent out of shape about it, as Mike says, he murmured to himself, his lips thinning. So many dead. And you cretins are adding to the total when you could be helping. If your protector had organized to get people out of Portland. He yelped involuntarily as one of the man-length darts plowed into the dirt near him. It sank a third of its length into the hard-packed rocky soil and quivered with a harsh whining sound that played along his nerves like a saw-edged bow on a violin. 3 more banged off the steel framework of his rock-thrower. And we are not going to stand around cranking Mr. Trebuchet down again, he thought, swallowing an uneasy mix of terror and exhilaration. Next time, really big, thick, movable shields to protect the crew?
All right,
he called out aloud.
Next flight of javelins. One of us runs back. You, Jackson, the minute they hit, you get out of your hole. We've given the Protector's men the kick in the ass we promised them.
The crew cheered again. Larson nodded, looking at the luminescent dial of the mechanical watch he'd found. Just before sunset. Though with this overcast, it was hard to tell. It was definitely getting dark, though. He looked towards the castle and saw only mud, because he certainly wasn't going to risk his life for a gesture. When you want to set a man up for a punch in the face, get someone to kick him in the ass, he muttered to the dirt. Thanks. for getting Astrid off to that bunch of Wiccans, Mike, he thought, not caring to share the thought even with the wall of watch he'd found. Just before sunset, though with this overcast it was hard to tell. It was definitely getting dark, though. He looked towards the castle and saw only mud, because he certainly wasn't going to risk his life for a gesture. When you want to set a man up for a punch in the face, get someone to kick him in the ass, he muttered to the dirt. Thanks for getting Astrid off to that bunch of Wiccans, Mike, he thought, not caring to share the thought even with the wall of his trench. Just the thing to keep her fascinated. With a wrench like a hand reaching into his chest and clutching. And take care of Pam and my kids, you hear? My strong and beautiful kids. Christ, why did it take a disaster to realize how great they are? The trail was doubly dark with the overcast night and the branches overhead. It smelled cold and wet as well. It hadn't started raining yet, but the wind from the west had a raw dampness to it, a hint of storms to come. They were nearly 1,000 feet above the castle at Echo Creek, and the air was colder here, closer to the approaching winter. Mike Havel grinned to himself in the darkness, an expression that had little mirth in it, placing each foot carefully on rock and damp earth. Which means we'd better get this done soon, if it's to be done at all, or we winter at Pendleton, which would be goddamn chancy for 6 reasons. He walked slowly but quietly, listening to the quick panting of the burdened men ahead, locals from the Cora force, hunters who knew the deer tracks over these hills as well as their homemakers. He didn't, and neither did Sam Aylward, but they moved almost as easily. Instinct and the faint reflected light and the whispering of air through trees and around rocks giving them clues enough. Both were dressed alike, in loose dark clothes and boots and knit caps and dark leather gloves. Havel had his sword across his back with a hilt ready over his left shoulder, and his bow case and quiver slanting to the right. Aylward had a take-down longbow resting in 2 pieces beside his arrows, all muffled so that they wouldn't rattle and under a buckled cap. Neither bore armor, besides buckler or targe. "Wish we could have practiced this more," the Englishman grumbled softly. They didn't need to keep absolute silence, but quietness was a habit in circumstances like this. Too much chance they'd have heard about it, Havel answered in the same tone, not a whisper, which actually traveled further than a soft conversational voice. That camp leaks like a sieve. Hell, I didn't tell you what I had in mind until I learned you'd done a lot of hang gliding, did I? A soft chuckle. Run me down on the others, he said. I presume they're the best, or I bloody well hope so. They're the best who happen to have the necessary experience. It's not a sport your ordinary Idaho plowboy takes up, Havel said. Pam's cold death with a sword, and she's learned the rest of the business very fast. Eric and Signe are pretty good. They've had 7 months' hard practice, and they're natural athletes, and I've seen them both in real action. Good nerves and good muga, both of them, and coming along fast. Aylward nodded, unseen in the darkness. Muga was a term they were both familiar with from unarmed combat training. It meant being aware of everything around you as a single interacting whole. And I wish to hell Signe was knocked up and off the A-list for now. We're married, for Christ's sake, he thought, then pushed it away with a swift mental effort. Can't afford to get worked up about that, or I'll make mistakes and get us killed. Christ Jesus, that's likely enough anyhow. There was a little amusement in the Englishman's voice. And this is probably the last chance you'll get to go off on your own, away from the paperwork and all those cloudy decisions, eh? Corporal to general. And if you knew how hard I'd fought to keep the same bloody thing from happening. Mike shrugged. Maybe not. Things are different now. No Pentagon, no brass. And how? There's probably nothing but bands of eaters haunting the Pentagon, he thought. Sort of, what did Greenberg call it? A literalized metaphor. He'd loathed the place and the city it was located in at long distance, every day of both hitches. Idly, I wonder what happened to the president. He'd never liked the man much.
Probably the Secret Service got him out and he's still running things. In about 100 square miles around Camp David, maybe.
He went on aloud.
Hell, what was that Greek king, the one who got all the way to India?
Alexander the Great?
Yeah, always the first one in. Here we are.
The hunters had brought them to the clearing on the crest of Echo Mountain and carried the hang gliders as well, bearing them lengthwise up the narrow trail. Aylward went forward to check them over, using a tiny metal lantern with a candle within and a movable shutter. Havel did his own examination, and then went the other way, up the sloping surface of the open space until he reached the steep, up-curled lip facing southeast. That made a natural slope to lie on with only his head above it, until all the others had gathered behind him. He used the time to see what could be seen of the castle, matching it to the detailed maps he'd memorized. There was more light over there than you'd expect. He hadn't seen anything like the actinic glare of the searchlight since before the change. The beam flickered out, traversing slowly back and forth along the parapet.
Puts them in the limelight, doesn't it?
Signy said from his left. Havel grinned in the darkness. Literally in the limelight. Lime burning in a stream of compressed air, with a big curved mirror behind it. That was what they'd used in theaters to light the stage, before electricity. His father-in-law's education was coming in really useful. "Don't look at it," he said, turning to repeat the order on the other side. "It's supposed to blind them, not us. All right, now take a good look at that tower. Match what you're seeing to the maps you studied." He did himself. The enemy had obligingly put torches all along the palisade of their modern Bailey castle, which would give them a better view of the first 10 yards and kill their chances of seeing anything beyond that, even without the searchlight stabbing into their eyes. "Amateurs," Aylward muttered. Havel nodded. The best way to see in the dark, barring night sight goggles, was to get out in the dark, well away from any source of light. It was a lot easier to see into an illuminated area than out of it. If he'd been in charge of that fort, he'd have killed every light, and had a mesh of scouts lying in the darkness, and damn the cost. The Corps men hadn't been able to threaten the fort, or get much past it, but they had been able to discourage the garrison from walking around after sunset. The torches outlined a round-shouldered rectangle, with Highway 20 running through it from east to west. There were buildings on either side of the roadway, and the circular cone of the motte halfway between the corner and the gatehouse. Obligingly, the Protector's men had a big iron basket full of pine wood burning on top of the tower. "Everybody satisfied they know where they're going?" Mike said, waiting for the nods. Aylward's had an edge in it. "We should have practiced this more, chum." Havel's reply, "We should have, but we couldn't. Pray hard. There's a nice updraft over the lip of this cliff, and we've got better than 1,500 feet of height on the target, so there's not going to be any problem with that. Come at the tower from the west, with a bit of height to spare. If you miss, just keep going. We've got people out there in the ground between our lines and the creek. And do not, I say this twice, do not launch until I'm down and give the signal." He caught Pamela's eye, and Aylward's. They could be counted on to restrain any adolescent foolishness. Eric was grinning, despite all that had happened since the change. "I told him he'd be a dangerous man once he got some experience. And Christ Jesus, I was right," Havel thought. It wasn't that his brother-in-law had a taste for blood, but he did like to fight. Signy and Pam were ready, both looking tautly calm. Good. They both know this is serious business. Aylward's calm was relaxed. For a moment, Havel felt a bitter envy of Juniper Mackenzie. God, I'd give a couple of fingers for someone with his skills and no ambition to be numero uno. It was time. Chapter 31. Two of the ranchers brought Michael Havel his wing. They helped him into the special quick-release harness as well. Nobody could have made it before the change, for fear of lawsuits. Well, the world may have collapsed into death and darkness, But at least we don't have lawyers and nervous Nellies trying to encase us in bubble wrap, he thought. Hurrah not. He gave a slight chuckle at the thought, and found them staring at him in awe as he tested his grip on the steering bar of the hang glider and the bundle of rope lashed to the frame above his head. It's not courage, boys, just realism, he thought sardonically. It's a little late for the Christ Jesus, this is crazy, run away reaction. One of them handed him a pair of goggles, and he slipped them down over his eyes. Then, remember the guide lights. See y'all soon. 4 steps forward, and leap. Wind pouring up the slope caught the black Dacron above him and jerked him skywards. The lights below dwindled, and the air grew yet more chill, making his cheeks burn as his body swung level in the harness. A great exultation flowed through him. Flying again, by God! In a way, this was even more fun than piloting light aircraft. Less power, but you were one with the air and its currents, like a fish in water. Pull back on the control bar and tilt yourself to the right. The nose came down. The right wingtip tilted up, and you went swooping across the night like an owl. You weren't operating a machine. You were flying, as close to being a bird as a human being could get, barring magic. Once you'd learned how, you didn't have to think of controlling the wing any more than you did of directing your feet. You just went where you wanted to go, down the mountainside and over the tall pines, out into the valley. There. The oval of the castle lay eastward, with a great beacon fire atop the tower on the motte. He banked, leaning, and pushing leftward, inertia pressing him against the harness as the hang glider swerved. And beyond it, beyond Echo Creek, 6 more big fires, set by Ken Larson, in a line that gave a precise bearing if you kept them strung like beads behind the beacon. And don't forget altitude, he told himself, lips peeling back from teeth despite the cold wind in his face. Too high and you overshoot and the mission fails. Too low and you bug splat on the side of the tower or land right in the middle of the bailey. Wind cuffed at him, pushing him away from the line of lights. The darkness rushed past. He imagined a line through the night, a line drawn straight towards the beacon fire, and tried to keep to it, like a landing approach at night but without instruments. Suddenly it was close. The beacon fire wasn't a flickering point of light in the darkness anymore. It was a pool of light, then a mass of flames spitting sparks upward, with the black lines of the basket outlined against the ruddy embers, and slightly too low. He was headed for the side of the tower, the rows of narrow arrow slits. Up! Push at the bar. Bring the nose of the triangular wing up. Just a little, just a little. Feel how she turns speed into height, but don't slow down too much, or you'll stall and drop. There was a checkerboard of machicolations around the top of the tower, unpleasantly like a gap-toothed grin with square teeth. They loomed up at him as he approached, swelling faster and faster. Mind empty, he felt for the currents of air. They turned rough and choppy, heat rising from torches and fires and hearths, bouncing him up and down as he sliced the air over the castle. It made things a lot harder, since he couldn't judge his angle of attack as well. Fabric cracked and thuddered along the rear edge of the hang glider. Nobody looking up, he thought, with some corner of his consciousness that wasn't in use, processing the information that flowed in through balance and the skin on the palms of his hands. No point in looking up. Not anymore. And the moment was now. A sentry turned at the last moment. He could see the man's mouth and eyes turn to great O's of horrified surprise. Havel pushed forward on the control bar with all his strength as the edge of the crenellations passed beneath him. Now he did want the wing to flare nose up and stall, turning from a lifting surface into a giant air brake catching at the wind. It jerked Havel's body forward with savage force as it stopped in mid-air, as if he'd run into a solid wall. He let that force pivot him in the harness, booted feet snapping forward as he swung like a trapeze artist. Both heels struck the guard in the face with an impact that knocked Havel's teeth together so hard that he tasted blood, despite the tight clinch of his jaw. Stars exploded before his eyes. Pain lanced through his body at the contact, and then again when he fell to the rough timbers buttocks first and 4 feet straight down. The guard flew backward and landed with his head folded back between his shoulders, so freshly dead that his heels drummed on the wood in a series of galvanic twitches. Havel scrabbled at the release of the harness and flipped himself to his feet while he took an instantaneous inventory. Bruises, but nothing torn or broken or too badly wrenched, and the joints worked. The wing fell back behind him, tenting up on the central pole that held the bracing wires.
Someday I'm going to pay for all this.
The other guard turned at the sound of boots meeting face and the jangling thump of an armored body falling limp as death. He stood goggling at the black-clad man from nowhere for a crucial 3 seconds, then brought his shield up and drew his spear back for a thrust. Havel drew the puko from its sheath in a backhand grip with his thumb on the pommel, the thick reverse of the blade lying along his forearm. By then he was charging in a swift, silent rush, and the spearhead jabbed out to meet him. He ducked under it with a motion as precise as a matador's, and the edged steel hissed past his left ear. He felt something cold touch him there, too thin and sharp to be pain, and a hot trickle down his neck. Then he was in past the point, the spear useless. His left hand clamped on the edge of the kite-shaped shield, down below the curve, and he wrenched with all his strength, pushing up and to his right, drawing the man's left arm across his body. In the same fluid motion, Havel's right hand punched to the left, and the blade of the puko snapped out from his fist, shaving sharp, and with all the force of arm and shoulder behind the cut. The spearman had been about to shout, mouth wide. Now, nothing came out of it but the sound of a loud cough, with a fine spray of blood. Havel threw an arm around him and dragged his body to the wall, taking care to prop him over the crenellations. His throat was sliced through the windpipe, and there was a lot of blood on a human body. He didn't want a huge pool making things slippery and perhaps dripping through to the guardroom below. Nobody would notice it running down the timbers of the Mott Tower. Probably. Not in time to make a difference. For a moment he stood, panting. Sweat soaked his clothes despite the night chill, running down his flanks and dripping from his chin mixed with blood. Then he shed his goggles, dragged an arm across his face, and let out a long breath. The brief burst of violent effort had taken as much out of him as half a day's marching, and he suppressed a bubble of half-hysterical laughter. I threw 6s again, and it's got to stop sometime. But not right now, please. Instead, he wiped the knife on the dead man's sleeve and resheathed it, and unslung the targe from his back. The night was quiet. The crackle of the fire was the loudest sound, and underneath it ran the soughing of the wind, and an occasional challenge and response from sentries on the wall. Christ Jesus, but I'd rather be back in my tent making out. I discover the delights of married life, and what do I get? Sent back to doing goddamn black side ops. And right now I'm remembering very vividly why I didn't re-enlist. A whistle sounded from the rear left, southwestern corner of the tower top. A wooden stand there held a section of 3-inch pipe, with a cone to listen or speak into. An old-fashioned speaking tube, the sort they'd used on ships before telephones. Havel trotted over, pulled out the rubber cork at the base of the cone, and whistled back. A voice floated up, tinny and distorted, but understandable enough.
Dinkerman! What the fuck are you two lazy SOBs doing up there, dancing?
We're doing zip, Sergeant Harvey, Havel called back. He kept his mouth away from the opening, and blessed the patriotic hooker who'd flat-backed her way into a thorough knowledge of the fort's routine. Men heard what they expected to hear, and saw that way too. If you were sitting on the only way up to a tower most of a year after the day the aircraft fell, you didn't expect to have someone drop in from the sky and replace your sentries. Except we're fighting off enemy paratroopers, he went on. That keeps us awake.
Ha, Dinkerman. You'd fucking better keep awake, the voice warned. It's 75 strokes with a black snake if I catch you napping.
Really vigorous zero-tolerance policy, Hobble thought. I was always in favor of discipline, but flogging? This is ridiculous. The round target let him signal by waving it in front of the fire. It would be visible to the others back on the mountainside, and to the men hidden out on the flat prairie behind the creek, too. Then he examined the basket that held the fire. It had a solid concave bottom, hinged on one side, and with a release catch on the other, presumably for cleaning and removing ash in the daytime. One more cheer for you, Ellie Strang, he thought. I'm going to see you get a retirement fund out of this, God damn me if I don't. The rest of the tower top was a flat square 30 feet by 30, bare save for a keg of water, a slop bucket, and racks of javelins and piles of stones just right for throwing down on anyone trying to get up. The only equipment was a little portable crane, probably used for hauling up firewood. That was on the eastern side. The floor felt solid beneath his boots. The intel was that it was 2 sets of 12 by 12 timbers laid at right angles to each other, with a couple of inches of asphalt and roofing shingle in between, the whole held together with massive bolts. The trapdoor was in the center, a slab of the same square timbers, strapped with sheet steel on top and bottom. There were strong steel bars that slid across it into loops set in the equally massive floor. Hobble grinned in the fire-lit night as he pulled them through and dropped in the locking pins. The tower had been designed for defense from the bottom up, each floor a fortress on its own if the one below was taken. Hence, the hinges were on this side, and the trap-door opened upward. Or didn't open, with the bars locked home. The story below was only 10 feet from floor to ceiling, and its trapdoor wasn't in line with this one. Good luck to you trying to batter it open when you twig to what's happened, he thought. You'd have to use drills and cutting tools. It'd take hours. The hang glider came apart easily. He bundled it off to one side. Then there was nothing to do but check the layout. So far their informants had been right all down the line. He looked over the outer, eastern side. The tower face was sheer to the ground. Its walls were yard-thick interlocking timbers, smoothly covered with 1/4-inch sheet steel in 10 by 10 squares, spiked to the wood, and then welded at the edges to make a homogeneous slab. Well, Ken was right. Throwing incendiaries at the surface wouldn't work, even if we could get within range. But the mound the tower stood on was narrow and steep, sloping right down into a dry moat filled with barbed wire. A staircase went down the inner side to the bailey. Eastward, a raised walkway connected the tower with the fighting platform behind the outer palisade. To the right, that ran right to the gatehouse. Not too many men on the wall. No point. If the Protector's CO here had them well drilled, they could turn out of their barracks and pack it full in far less time than an assault force would need to get going. But his ears caught a flutter of cloven air. He turned, back against the crenellations, mouth firm to a thin line. Signy was scheduled to come in next. She was also supposed to be a better hang glider than he was. That might be true, but he was certain she hadn't had as much time in the air, or experience at judging distances in the dark, with a life for a forfeit if you were wrong. He pulled out one more piece of equipment, a ping-pong paddle with one side painted luminescent white. His heart tried to hammer as he waved it back and forth with the bright side westward, but he seized control by forcing his breath into regularity. Slow, steady, and deep. Tension unlocked, and he waited with his hands ready, knees bent and weight forward on the balls of his feet. His eyes were dazzled by looking at the fire and the torches below. The black wing and black-clad flyer were invisible until the last moment.
"Too high!"
he barked, throwing out his hands and waving the paddle downward.
"Too high, damn it! Christ Jesus, too high!"
The wing cut across the stars overhead, a wedge of deeper blackness. Signy seemed to realize her mistake at the last moment, and did what Havel had done, flared the nose upright to let the wing break itself against the air. She'd cut it far too close, though. It was above him, and the eastern edge of the tower, when it jerked to a near halt against the air and started to slide downward. Havel hopped backward onto the top of one of the crenellations, one foot braced in the arm of the cargo crane. His hand caught something, clamped hard on a guy wire. It would have cut his hand to the bone like piano wire through cheese, save for the tough leather of his glove. The weight tried to snatch him forward off the wall. Would have, if he hadn't had the crane under his foot for leverage. He threw himself backwards instead, and it pivoted inward like a weight on the end of a rope. The half-seen length of Signy's body came down half on and half off the wall, with a startled oof as the edge drove the wind out of her. Havel released the wingtip, and she started to slide backward. He leapt and grabbed, a black blur in the darkness, and his hands slapped down on the control bar. He heaved again, feeling the muscles of his shoulders crackle with a grunting strain, heedless of the way she knocked against the parapet. The alternative was falling 60 feet straight down into a moat full of sharp angle iron and barbed wire.
"You all right?"
he asked.
"No,"
she wheezed, one hand on her stomach and the other rubbing her knee.
"But I'll do."
"That you will," he said, grinning relief, and helped her out of her harness, stripping her section of rope loose from the frame. By then it was time. After they saw his signal from the tower top, the others were supposed to launch at 4-minute intervals. He and Signy spread out to the eastern corners of the tower, waving their paddles with a light side westward. This time it was Aylward, and he flared his wing neatly right in the middle of the flat space. He shed his equipment with businesslike speed, then pulled out his longbow and snapped the halves together. The bottom half of the riser was a metal-lined hollow, and the top its mirror image. "Next," Havel muttered, as the Englishman strung his weapon. That was Pamela. She came in so low that for a heart-stopping instant he thought she was going to ram the tower's western wall. "Not quite," Signy said beside him, with a gasp of relief. Instead, she skimmed it, so close that a corner of the control bar tapped against the corner of a crenellation. The wing went pinwheeling across the surface of the tower, while she threw her hands in front of her face. Despite that, there was a bleeding graze across cheek and nose when she rose. Havel gave her a nod as she came to her feet, and collapsed the wing, hauling it aside to clear the landing area. "One more and we're safe. On top of the tower of an enemy castle," she said. "Yeah," he replied dryly. He did a quick check. They all had their tools ready, and a bandolier of rope over his shoulder. The speaking tube whistled again. Havel pulled out the plug.
"Dinkerman! Why the hell have you locked the trap door?"
Sergeant Harney barked.
"Get it open, now!"
"Can't do that, Sergeant," Havel said regretfully. "The enemy paratroopers are landing more men."
"You make me look bad in front of the Baron, and I'll have your fucking balls for this, Dinkerman!"
Harvey shrieked.
"And that's a goddamn promise!"
"Oops," Havel thought, replacing the plug in mid-tirade. "Surprise inspection coming. Well, unless I misread the Protector's little toy army completely, Sergeant Harvey is going to do everything he can to get that hatch open before he pushes it up the chain of command. Probably afraid of old Black Snake himself." He grinned like a shark. That was the problem with the zero-fault policy. People got desperate to cover their asses, rather than get the job done. The Protector was just the type to assume warriors could only be disciplined by terror, too. "But what, O Protector, do you call men who can be easily controlled by fear?" he asked sardonically. Signy's shout of alarm brought him wheeling around. Eric's hang glider was coming in.
"Too high!"
someone shouted. This time it was really too high. 15 or 20 feet too high, even with the steep dive he'd started when he realized the mistake.
"Wave him on,"
Havel said. They did, with blasphemous additions from Havel and Aylward. The glider was still at least 10 feet above the level of the crenellations when it crossed the eastern side of the tower. Havel caught a glimpse of Eric's face, wide-eyed and teeth bared.
No, just pass on and clear the wall,"
Havel shouted, knowing exactly what was going through that adrenaline-saturated teenage male mind. The shout was probably futile and possibly dangerous if Sergeant Harvey was listening at one of the arrow slits below. Eric tried to bank and turn instead, and for that he was too low. Any turn loose enough not to stall would bring him around below the level of the tower's top. He saw that and tried to turn more tightly instead, more tightly than the hang glider's speed and lift could take. For a long instant the black shape hung with its left wing point down. Then it fell off and fluttered groundward like a huge leaf falling in autumn. Then it struck, vanishing in the blackness to the left of the bridge that spanned the mott's protective ditch. Signy stifled a scream as she watched her brother fall. Havel nodded respect as she choked it back, and again as Eric augured in silently. "That's torn it," he said grimly. "Let's go. Get that cable down." A heave and a kick sent the piled firewood toppling. It was mostly pine, and nicely dry. With the tip of his sword he flicked at the release catch on the fire basket, skipping backward as a torrent of ash and embers and burning wood came flooding out. "Stay warm, Sergeant Harvey," he thought. Behind him he could hear a chunk sound, then a whir as the cable on the crane paid out and down. As he turned, Aylward had swung the crane out. That put the cable 6 feet out from the wall, and taken stance beside it. 1 foot up on a crenellation, an arrow knocked, his quiver over his shoulder with the cap open and the spare bundle of arrows leaning against the parapet ready to his hand.
"Go!"
Havel said. Pam nodded, leaned out, grabbed the cable and went down it with her shins and boots locked around it in good rappelling form. All that rock climbing hadn't gone to waste. He followed, stepping off into space, grabbing the cable and locking it between hands and feet. It was smooth, woven wire, 3/4 inch, capable of bearing a dozen tons, and well greased. He clamped hard, felt heat on the insteps of his feet and palms of his hands as friction heated boots and gloves. There was one wash of light after another as he fell through the darkness, narrow slivers of light, lanterns coming on behind the firing slits of the tower. Then he let go and fell the last 8 feet, landing crouched and drawing his sword with a hiss of metal on leather. Pam's was already out. The walkway they'd landed on was 12 feet across, and the door into the tower was about the same width and height. It had already swung partly open, outwards, and he squinted against the wash of lantern light from within. Men crowded forward, half-armed, confused. The bear killer's sword mistress danced. Her targe beat aside a spearhead, and then the backsword flicked out in a blurring thrust. There was a gurgling scream, a moment of whirling chaos as a man staggered with blood spurting from a severed jugular. A louder scream as she pierced a thigh beneath a scale mail shirt, ripping the point free with a twist. Havel stepped in, swerved aside from a clumsy spear thrust, grabbed the wood behind the metal and jerked forward. The wielder came with the weapon, running face first into the punching brass guard of Havel's sword with a wet crunch that jarred up his arm and back with a gruesome finality. The impact kicked the man's body back into the arms of his comrades. That left 3 dying men in the entrance, blocking the others with their thrashing and spreading confusion with their screams. Havel and Pamela set their shoulders to the door and ran it closed in stamping unison, like football forwards at a training bar, desperate with haste. Someone would think to get a crossbow eventually.
Boom!
As it rammed home. Pamela was already down on one knee, knocking home 3 wedges with a wooden mallet, and then sticking the handle through loops at their rear to give them each 6 twists. Ken Larson had designed them to screw open and lock rear-facing tines into the wood, and Springs had a functioning machine shop running off an air compressor and horse-cranked belts. Havel was faintly conscious of boots hitting the walkway behind him, a shout, the clash of steel. There were 2 firing slits on either side of the doorway, and only one of him. He'd just have to be quick. His sword went point down in the wood beneath his feet. The aerosol can came out instead, and his lighter in his left hand. A savage smile, despite the need of the moment. He'd gotten in trouble for doing this at school, too, but it had impressed Shirley no end. This can was much larger, and its contents a lot more volatile. The mist sprayed across the flame and turned to flame itself. A 4-foot gout of it through the slit and into the eyes and face of the crossbowman within. Then 2 more to set the edges aflame. A bolt whipped out from the other slit. He leapt across, repeated the trick, heard a scream within just as the can hissed dry.
"Eric's alive!"
Signy called, as Pamela and he whirled and snatched up their blades. Havel spared a glance that way. There was more light. The fire on the tower top was brighter as the timbers of the platform caught. Lanterns from the upper stories were brought to the firing slits, and there was a growing blaze around the ground-level slits he'd torched. That made the black shape of the hang glider in the moat clear enough, and the form writhing out from beneath it. 2 of the sharp-pointed angle irons that braced the wire filling the moat pierced the cloth, but none had speared into Erik Larson. The face raised to the light was still a mask of blood. It had gone into the barbed wire at speed, with only his arms and hands to shelter it, though the goggles had probably saved his eyes. But the wire saved his life, too, Havel knew. The springy mass of it had acted like a pile of mattresses to cushion the impact.
"Get him out!" he said. "Don't get caught up in that stuff!"
Signy nodded, lifted the coil of rope from her shoulder, and hooked the grapnel over the railing of the walkway. Then she went over it backward, rappelling down as they had on the cable. "Slight glitch in the plan," Havel said. Pamela and he exchanged a glance, then stepped past the grapnel. There was another 10 yards of walkway beyond that, then the broad, well-braced fighting platform inside the castle's palisade. Just across from that joining was one of the throwing engines, a metal-shaped hulking under its tarpaulin. The platform extended into a circle around it, and their intel said it could be quickly traversed 360 degrees. And running towards them were a dozen men, spearmen with shields, and crossbows following. More men shouted and milled around along the wall, but they'd be getting things in gear soon enough. "Horatius on the fucking bridge," Havel snarled.
"Except that the Etruscans were too idiotic to stand back and shoot arrows," Pamela said tightly. "You know, this isn't what I had in mind when I went to veterinary college."
Noise was mounting, too. Shouts, the thud of boots on timber, and the growing crackle of the fire on the top of the tower. The snap of bowstring on bracer was lost in it, and the wet, meaty thunk of an arrowhead striking flesh at 300 feet per second. One of the rearmost crossbowmen stopped and raised his weapon, then buckled at the knees and collapsed forward. Havel saw the arrows strike the next man, even before the first dropped face down. An armor scale sparked as the bodkin point struck, and another, working forward from the rear. The tower top was 40 yards away. The ripple of fire would have done credit to a bolt-action sniper rifle in an expert's hands.
"Angel on our shoulder,"
Havel said, and then,
"Hake Pale!"
3 men survived. The first 3 in the enemy group, too close to the bear killers for even a marksman of Aylward's quality to shoot at safely. He transferred his attention to the walkway, sweeping it to left and right. All the attackers were in full-length hauberks, with a big kite-shaped shield of the Protector's forces. Havel was acutely aware that he had a lot more target area to cover, with only his sword and targe to protect himself. Not to mention Signy and her damned fool of a brother,